When you think about World War I, you probably picture soldiers going over the top into no man's land, getting cut down by machine gun fire. That's the image we've all seen in films and history books. Machine guns weren't the biggest killer of the First World War. Not even close. Artillery was responsible for roughly 70% of all casualties on the Western Front. And the reason why goes far beyond simple firepower. Let me give you some perspective on this. During the Battle of Verdun in 1916, in the opening bombardment, German guns fired well over 1 million shells over roughly the first day, with some accounts placing over 1 million within just the first several hours. The barrage was so intense that soldiers described it as a continuous roar that never stopped. The French fired back with similar intensity. By the end of that 10-month battle, over 60 million artillery shells had been fired at Verdun alone, with combined casualties exceeding 700,000 men. The landscape was so thoroughly devastated that it's still too dangerous to walk through large sections of it today, over a century later. Understanding how artillery actually worked in World War I reveals why it became such an efficient killer. The standard field gun of the war was the French 75mm. The Germans had their 77mm field gun. The British used 18-pounders. These weren't the biggest guns of the war, not by a long shot, but they were the workhorses. The French 75 was revolutionary because of its hydro-pneumatic recoil system. The barrel would slide backward while the carriage stayed in place, absorbing the recoil so the gun didn't need to be re-aimed after every shot. A well-trained crew could fire 15 to 30 rounds per minute with this gun. That's one shell every 2 to 4 seconds. Then you had the heavy howitzers, the German 150mm, the British 9.2-inch, the French 155. These fired shells weighing anywhere from 95 to 290 pounds. And they didn't fire in a flat trajectory like field guns. They lobbed their shells high into the air, so they'd come down almost vertically onto their targets. The largest artillery pieces were absolute monsters. The German 420mm howitzer, nicknamed Big Bertha, fired shells weighing 1,800 pounds. The shell alone was as heavy as a small car. When it hit, it created a crater 30 feet across and 20 feet deep. These shells weren't designed to just blow things up. They were engineered specifically to kill human beings in the most efficient way possible. High explosive shells were the most common. They were filled with TNT, amytal, or similar explosives. When they detonated, the metal casing fragmented into thousands of jagged pieces of shrapnel, traveling at supersonic speeds. A typical 155mm high explosive shell created a lethal fragmentation zone on the order of tens of meters, with danger extending even farther in the open. Anyone within that zone who wasn't in deep cover was either dead or seriously wounded. Shrapnel shells were even more sinister. These were designed to explode in the air above the target, showering down hundreds of steel balls and metal fragments. They were specifically designed to kill soldiers in open ground or shallow trenches. The shells had a time fuse that could be set to detonate at a specific height and distance. When it worked properly, it was devastatingly effective against troops in the open. Then there were gas shells. The Germans fired the first gas shells in 1915, and in some sectors, late in the war, a significant proportion of shells were gas. The Germans even developed a color-coding system. Green cross for lung-destroying agents like chlorine and phosgene. Blue cross for mask breakers, designed to force soldiers to remove their gas masks. Yellow cross for mustard gas. White cross for tear gases. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas could be delivered in massive quantities through artillery bombardment. Unlike gas released from cylinders, which depended on wind direction, gas shells could be placed exactly where you wanted them. What made artillery so lethal wasn't just the explosive power or the shrapnel. It was the impossibility of defense. In previous wars, soldiers could see the enemy coming. You could take cover, you could fire back, you could retreat. But artillery fire came from miles away. You couldn't see the guns firing at you. You couldn't shoot back at them. And most terrifyingly, You often couldn't hear the shells coming until it was too late. The sound of an incoming shell depended on its size and trajectory. Smaller shells from field guns made a distinctive screaming or whistling sound as they flew through the air. Soldiers learned to judge roughly where a shell would land based on the sound. The German 77mm shells traveled faster than the speed of sound, so soldiers heard the whiz of the traveling shell before the bang from the gun itself. They called these whiz-bangs, and they gave virtually no warning. Heavy howitzer shells were different. They fell from such a height and at such an angle that you often heard the explosion before you heard the shell coming. Veterans describe the psychological horror of this. You'd be standing in a trench, talking to your friends, and suddenly the man next to you would just disappear in a fountain of dirt and blood. No warning, no time to react. Just there 1 second, gone the next. The trenches were supposed to protect you, but they became death traps when artillery found them. A shell that landed in a trench could kill or wound everyone within 30 feet. The blast would travel along the trench line, funneled by the walls, and the shrapnel would ricochet off the sides, hitting men who thought they were in cover. Dugouts offered better protection, but they had their own horrors. A direct hit from a heavy shell could collapse a dugout entirely, burying everyone inside alive. There are documented cases of entire platoons being entombed in their own shelters. In the 2000s and 10s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 21 German soldiers in a shelter who were buried alive when an Allied shell exploded above their tunnel. They were found in sitting positions on a bench or lying down, exactly where they'd been when the earth came down on them over a century earlier. Artillery didn't just kill you outright. It could bury you alive under tons of earth, blow off your limbs and leave you bleeding out in no man's land, rupture your internal organs without leaving a visible mark on your body, or drive you completely insane from the constant bombardment. Shell shock, what we'd call PTSD today, was a direct result of prolonged artillery bombardment. Men who'd never shown any signs of mental illness would break down completely after days or weeks of constant shelling. They'd shake uncontrollably, lose the ability to speak, or simply curl up in a ball and stop responding to anything around them. The British Army alone treated over 80,000 cases of shell shock during the war. At the Somme, shell shock cases surged so sharply that some reports describe them as a huge share of the casualty burden, with figures as high as around 40% sometimes cited. The numbers became so alarming that in 1917, shell shock was entirely banned as a diagnosis in the British Army, and mentions were even censored in medical journals. The numbers from specific battles show artillery's dominance as a killing weapon. On August 22, 1914, during the Battle of the Frontiers, German artillery killed 27,000 French soldiers in a single day. It became the bloodiest single day in French military history. At the Somme in 1916, the British fired 1.5 million shells in the week before the infantry attack. That's roughly 8 shells per second for 7 straight days. The Germans fired back with similar intensity. Of the roughly 1 million casualties at the Somme, it's estimated that over 700,000 were caused by artillery. At Passchendaele in 1917, the British fired over 4 million shells during the battle. The bombardment was so intense that it destroyed the drainage systems in the low-lying Flanders fields. The entire battlefield turned into a swamp of mud and water-filled shell craters. Men and horses drowned in the mud. Wounded soldiers who fell into shell craters couldn't get out and drowned in the filthy water. The artillery had literally transformed the landscape into something as deadly as the shells themselves. The Italians and Austro-Hungarians faced similar horror on the Isonzo front. During the 12 battles of the Isonzo, artillery fire in the mountains triggered avalanches. Entire units were buried by artillery-triggered avalanches, adding another dimension of terror to an already nightmarish battlefield. World War I artillery differed from any previous war because of the industrial capacity to produce shells in unimaginable quantities. At the start of the war, nobody had enough shells. The British ran into what they called the shell crisis of 1915. They were firing shells faster than they could produce them. But by 1916, the industrial production of artillery shells had ramped up to levels that would have been incomprehensible just a decade earlier. Britain alone produced over 218 million artillery shells during the war, ramping up to over 70 million shells per year by war's end. France produced roughly 290 million. Germany, despite being blockaded, still managed to produce around 280 million shells. The United States, after entering the war in 1917, was producing shells at a rate of over 100,000 per day by 1918. Think about what that means. These weren't bullets. These were large, complex pieces of ordnance, each one requiring precision manufacturing, explosives, fuses, and metal casings. And they were being produced and fired by the millions. The landscape of the Western Front became a moonscape. Aerial photographs from 1918 show areas where there isn't a single square meter of ground that hasn't been torn up by shells. The village of Passchendaele was hit by so many shells that it literally ceased to exist. Not a single building remained standing. Not a single brick remained on top of another brick. The more shells you fired, the more you had to fire to achieve the same effect. Early in the war, artillery could destroy trenches and defensive positions relatively easily. But as the war went on, defenses got deeper and stronger. The Germans developed defense in depth, with multiple trench lines, deep dugouts reinforced with concrete and steel, and carefully planned fallback positions. To destroy these defenses, you needed even more shells. This created a horrific cycle. More shells meant deeper dugouts. Deeper dugouts meant you needed heavier shells to penetrate them. Heavier shells meant the men caught in the open had even less chance of survival. The French experience at Verdun perfectly illustrates this. The German plan was simple. They would attack a position that the French could not afford to lose for symbolic reasons. Then they would use artillery to bleed the French army white. The German chief of staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, literally called it a strategy of attrition. The goal wasn't to take ground. It was to kill so many Frenchmen with artillery fire that France would be forced to surrender. It nearly worked. French soldiers rotated through Verdun on what they called the Sacred Road. Almost every French soldier served at Verdun at some point. They described it as being fed into a meat grinder. The constant artillery fire, the inability to fight back effectively, the randomness of death. You could do everything right, follow every order, be the best soldier in your unit, and a shell could land next to you, and that would be it. One French soldier wrote in his diary, "Verdun has become a furnace. We are the fuel." Another wrote, "I would rather face 100 machine guns than spend one more day under this shelling." A German soldier at the Somme described the horror from the other side. They were under incessant bombardment, day and night. Shells of various calibers coming constantly. Their dugouts crumbled and fell upon them. Sometimes they found their comrades suffocated, sometimes smashed to pulp. Men became hysterical in the bunkers, wanting to run out, and had to be physically held back. Even the rats became hysterical, coming into the shelters seeking refuge from the terrific artillery fire. By 1916, artillery tactics had evolved into something terrifyingly efficient. Armies on all sides developed the rolling barrage, also called the creeping barrage. Artillery would fire just ahead of advancing infantry, moving forward at a walking pace, typically 50 meters per minute. The infantry would follow right behind the curtain of exploding shells. Attackers had to follow so closely that friendly fire losses were expected if the barrage was being used effectively. Men were expected to advance so close to their own exploding artillery that some of them would inevitably be killed by it. The price of all this artillery fire wasn't just paid in human lives. The French government estimated it would take 700 years to clear all the unexploded ordnance from the battlefields. Even today, farmers in France and Belgium regularly plow up live shells. A specialist French munitions clearing agency collects around 900 tons of unexploded munitions every single year. The Zone Rouge, the red zone around Verdun, contains an estimated 12 million unexploded shells. It's still off limits to human activity. Millions of shells that were fired never exploded. Estimates suggest about 1 in 4 shells fired at the Somme failed to detonate. They're still there, buried in the ground, rusting away. Every year, several people are killed in France and Belgium when they accidentally detonate old artillery shells from World War I. Dud chemical shells can still split and leak, and mustard agent in particular can still burn skin and lungs more than 100 years later. The wounds artillery caused were catastrophic. Shrapnel fragments severed limbs and destroyed whole parts of the body. Hot flying metal could tear through flesh to create twisted, ragged wounds, or rip faces off entirely. Germany performed approximately 67,000 limb amputations during the war. Britain performed approximately 41,000. Soldiers died from blast alone, their lungs destroyed without an outward mark on their bodies. Artillery killed 70% of soldiers in World War I because it was impersonal, inescapable, and industrial. You couldn't fight back against it. You couldn't outsmart it. You couldn't outrun it. All you could do was huddle in whatever shelter you had and hope that the next shell didn't have your name on it. The truly horrifying part? The men who designed these systems, who built the factories, who produced millions of shells, they weren't monsters. They were engineers and workers doing their jobs. They probably never met the men their shells would kill. World War I artillery turned warfare into an industrial process. Killing became a matter of logistics and production quotas. The soldiers who survived the war carried the psychological scars of artillery bombardment for the rest of their lives. The phrase shell-shocked entered the language because there was no existing term for what these men had experienced. The constant noise, the random death, the feeling of utter helplessness. It broke something fundamental in tens of thousands of men. These men endured something no human should ever have to face, and they did it for years. The least we can do is remember exactly what they went through. Subscribe to make sure their stories don't get buried along with those millions of shells still rusting in French fields.